Okay, so we're continuing on Lamed Beis Amid Beis, where we left off right before Pesach, and the subject here was the question of whether Tsar Balachayim is Doraisa or not. In other words, we were questioning whether the mitzvah of relieving pain from an animal is Midoraisa Midrabanan. So starting on Lamed Beis Amid Aleph into Amid Beis, we had this continuous discussion back and forth, and we brought Ryan. Now we are about 4 or 5 lines from the wide lines, and the Gemara is giving us a mnemonic, which we've seen before, where the Gemara gives us Rashi Teves of words that will help us understand the subject matter. So what do we mean? Take a look in the parenthesis, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the beginning of the wide lines on the bottom of Lamed Beis Amid Beis, and the Gemara there says Simin Behemet Ohev Sone Rabson. So what the Gemara is telling us is that using these words, we're going to bring examples. We'll see this in a minute of circumstances which may help us understand whether or not Tsar Balachayim is Doraisa or not. So it's a little bit of a cryptic statement, but now we're going to put it into action. We'll see what we mean. Okay. So the Gemara starts, Lema Messiah. Let's just say we have a proof. I mean, we're going back and forth, and we're questioning whether or not Tsar Balachayim is Doraisa. Lema Messiah. We have a beferish proof, one way or the other. Why? It says, Behem in the Brisa, Behem is Ovid Kachavin, that when it comes to alleviating the suffering of an animal, a behema of an ovid koichavim. Remember, ovid koichavim is a idol worshiper. So when we talk about a non-Jew, it's kind of a benign statement. Oh, he's not Jewish. But ovid koichavim is de jure someone who is an idolater who we have forbidden relations with. We can't have even ano. Forget about anything else. Also bahano. So behemoth ovid kachavim mitapel kebehemoth Yisrael. That's what the Brisa says. That you can deal with it. You mitapel. In other words, you're fuss with it, so to speak. The same as behemoth Yisrael. In fact, the Gemara amit b'shloim tsar balachayim deraisa. If you say tsar balachayim is deraisa, that it's an overarching principle over everything else. Now I understand why you're metapel with it, just like you are a behema Yisrael. Because why? It's deraisa. But if you say tsar balachayim is not deraisa, why do you even bother? It's not deraisa. It's a rabbinic inclusion. And then we have the question of whether or not you're supposed to deal with the Isser Hano of an idol worshiping animal, or the animal of an idol worshiper, and so it's a whole different question. So we have proof from that brisa that it has to be deraisa. Otherwise, why would we equate an animal of an idol worshiper together with the animal of a Jew? That's the Gemara's kasha. So in other words, l'chayra, this should be an answer to the question. So it's a good question. L'chayra gives good proof. Says the Gemara, no, you can't bring a raya from there. Hasam mishum iba. You know why you have to be metapel? Why you have to deal with the behema of an idol worshiper? Why you have to fuss with it? Because there's something called iba. So let's take a look at Rashi. So Rashi says further up, Lema Messiah le Rava. Let's say this is a raya to Rava. Rava was the one who initiated it and said in this sequence that Tsar Balachayim is doraisa. So the Gemara says in our what we're about to say, this Lema Messiah should be a raya to Rava. Mitapel bo lifrok mas'ah. In other words, to take off its burden. I amrit lav doraisa the Tama mishum. Okay, so before we get to Rashi, so the Gemara answers, and the Gemara says no. no proof. Hasur mishum iba. What is iba? Iba is this understanding that Jews and non-Jews have to live together. If we don't live together in harmony, then the goyim will stand up and do us harm. And unfortunately, throughout history, this is what Jews have had to do. They've had to sort of make nice and always be on the good side of the goyim. Lahavdil. But the story of Fiddler on the Roof is a good example of how the Jews of that little town had to always make nice with the military, even when the military said, no, we got to show force. We got to come in, we got to beat you up, but don't think we're beating you up. It's really because everybody needs to see that we're beating you up. And in other words, the relationship between Jew and non-Jew has always been fragile throughout history. So Iba is in a sense, is the act of acting appropriately with the non-Jew in order for there to be shalom. Let's call it that way. That's what Iba is. So the Gemara's answer is, you know what? It's no raya that it's midaraisa, right? It could be deraisa, it could be tzemacham, not deraisa. You know why you have to treat the non-Jewish animal like the Jewish animal? Mishum Iba, because of the relationship between Jew and non-Jew has to be in balance. That's why we do it. Even if there's no deraisa, even if it's not deraisa, we've got to treat their animal like our animal. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble. They'll beat us up. So Iba, that's what Iba is. So Rashi says, if you say it's not deraisa, the tama mishum Iba, in other words, okay, so this is really, this Rashi goes a little bit further ahead from where we are. But so the Gemara's answer here is, l'chayra, we have a kasha, you see that it's deraisa, because if it wasn't deraisa, why would you treat their animal like our animal? Answers the Gemara, mishum Iba. Because of Iba, because of this delicate relationship between the Jews and the non-Jews, therefore throw Tzar Balachayim out the window. Okay. Says the Gemara Vayta Hochinam in Mistabra. And it's logical. It's logical to say that it's Mishum Iba. The Ketani, because we learned in Hoyset Tu'una Yayin Osir Ein Zakik Law. What do we say? We say that if the animal was carrying yayin nesach, so we know what yayin nesach is. Today we say yayin nesach is it's the wine of a non-Jew, and therefore you can't use it. So by the way, that's why bishul yayin, this whole concept of cooked wine, many years ago, I remember even as a young boy, they didn't cook wine. So if we went somewhere and there was a guy, then I remember specifically that we were at a hotel and we were at a table and there was a Jewish waiter who had a bottle of wine wrapped in a towel, and he came to the table to pour the wine. Why did he do that? Because it wasn't cooked wine and we didn't want a guy to handle the wine. So he handled the wine in a wrapped towel. You don't see that anymore because
that actually happened. We actually had that situation recently. A few years ago, there was a wine tasting at Shomrei, nice fancy event, and found out that some of the wines that the people in charge wanted to have were non-mavushal, very nice wines.
Right.
So Josh Breitstein, and I think maybe he got somebody else to help him, had to specifically, because they had all kinds of help around the, not necessarily Jewish and so on. So Josh Breitstein was handling and the rabbi set up a whole procedure how to make sure that no glasses of wine went to anybody but a Jew, etc., to make sure that it was all handled that way, because otherwise it would have been problems.
Right. So that's what we call yayin nesech. But where does it come from? Because yayin nesech is what the goyim used to use for their various incense or sacramental uses. In other words, so the wine itself became a davar asa. It wasn't just neutral. It was a bottle of wine owned by a non-Jew. It was actually used for purposes that would make us, that were improper from our standpoint. Okay, so it was tame, if you will. So there the Brisa says, if an animal was laden with yayin osir, with forbidden wine, you don't ein zakik lo. You don't help. In other words, you have to let it stay there. Says the Gemara, if you say that Tsar Balachayim is not the Raisa, you know why you don't help? Because there's no overarching requirement of Tsar Balachayim. Remember, Tsar Balachayim goes to the animal, not to the wine. It doesn't go to the substance. So you would have a conflict between dealing with the wine, which is Yayin Nesach, or helping an animal, which is a mitzvah in the Torah, if we say it is midoraisa. So, you know why you don't help? Because it's not the raisa. Why don't you help? Why does that brisa say that if it was just carrying yayin nesach, you don't offer to help? Why don't you offer to help? It's Tsar Balachayim Doraisa, which supersedes the inyan of Isser. In other words, remember, Yayin Nesach is not Midoraisa. Yayin Nesach is Midorabanan. So if you have Yayin Nesach Midorabanan and Tsar Balachayim Midoraisa, guess which takes precedent? The Doraisa. So if the Doraisa takes precedent and you have to unload the animal, why does that Brisa say Ein Zakik Lo when it's carrying Yayin Nesach Fakir? You should unload it only because you're fulfilling the mitzvah in the Torah. So that should be proof. In other words, he's saying from that Brisa, we should have proof that it's not Midaraisa, because otherwise, why wouldn't you do it? So the Gemara gives it in a twist. The Gemara is now going to explain this Brisa a little bit differently, and it's going to have an impact. So Amayin Zakla says the Gemara, yayin aser ein zakikla. For loading, you don't help. So now we've made a distinction between loading and unloading. Now, what have we said until now? Until now, we've said that of the two, we have hakim takim and azov tazov. It's different. Unloading is not the same as loading. With unloading, when the animal is in pain and needs help, so therefore you go ahead and you help and you unload it. But for loading, where the animal is not in tsar, because all you're doing is taking the animal and putting all the stuff back onto the animal, then that's not a problem. So he's saying the Brisa is speaking ula te'una. Yayin oser ein zakik lo. Really, we can say Tsar Balachayim is the Araisa. We don't have to say it's not the Araisa. We can say it is the Araisa. You know why you don't help here? Because it's an incident of loading. And loading, you're not forced to help the animal. The animal's not in pain. So from this, we would glean that if the animal was in pain because you have to unload, that you would unload even Dover Osir, even though it's Yayin Nesach, at which Midrabanan you're not allowed to handle. You can't deal with. Still, the Isser de Oraisa of Tsar Balachayim would supersede. So in other words, there's no proof positive from this particular situation, whether it's Doraisa or not. It could be Doraisa, but we're talking about a non-Doraisa event. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand, and I was thinking, and we got to it, like, yeah, it makes sense to say you can unload because that's a Tsar Balachayim, can't load because that would be helping the goy with his Yayin Nesach.
Right.
But why? But I never heard that there was that you were forbidden to touch or move Yayin Nesach. You can't drink it, you can't benefit from it. So if you want to argue that you shouldn't load the Yayin Nesach, that makes sense, because in a sense you're benefiting because you're helping the goy with that item.
Right.
But it's not that you're categorically
No.
forbidden.
I don't mean touch it. I don't mean touching that you literally can't touch it. I'm saying that you don't load it because that would be hana'ah.
Right. But hana indirectly because you're helping the goy with his Yayin Nesach. So through the Yayin Nesach, you're getting his gratitude. So that makes sense. Whereas on the unloading, there shouldn't be any question at all. This isn't like touching chametz on Pesach,
No.
that
No. What we mean here is that he in no way should he be helpful, because any kind of help is what we call hana. And since it's also bahana, that's a wide ranging field. What's also bahana? Helping the goy is hana, because it benefits you with the relationship to the goy. So and you can't do that with yayin nesa. So the Gemara's ultimate conclusion from this situation is, I can't prove it one way or the other, because really you could say it is deraisa, but we're talking about loading, and loading is a lesser category. So in other words, if it was unloading, I might say it supersedes the Hanor question, because it's midaraisa. So in other words, we have no proof one way or the other. Okay.
A question.
Yeah.
If one possible hypothesis here, obviously, is that Tsar Bali Chaim is the Oraisa. Why doesn't the Gemara reach the Hava Amina in all this discussion, that the animal doesn't know any better? An animal is an animal that doesn't know from Yain Nisach, it doesn't know from Goy or Jewish. That alone is proof. I mean, the animal, no matter who owns it or what it's doing, Tsar Bali Chaim is the Oraisa.
Right. So in other words, that was what the Gemara started. When we started out this sugya, we said that there's a brisa that says that you have to be metapel, meaning you have to deal with or help, so to speak, an animal of a non-Jew as well as an animal of a Jew. So to your point, that means that we look at the animal is struggling, and if we say that the animal is struggling and you have to help it just like the animal of a Jew, that should be a raya that it is d'oraisa, because otherwise, why would you deal with an animal? Why would you even help? Why would you try?
Right, but now we're looking for alternatives, right?
But we're trying to dig in and see, is that a foolproof theory? In other words, I get your theory, and I understand why you say it's d'oraisa, but is it really d'oraisa, or can we somehow flip the switch
and say there was a totally different reason, so it's not going to be proof positive?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's a different reason entirely, and therefore it could be d'oraisa or not d'oraisa, but it doesn't matter.
But that's not proof positive.
That's not the fact of exactly. It's
okay,
all right.
throw out another idea which may or may not hold any water, but which is, we have on Shabbos, we're saying in Kiddush, your animals have to rest, and we have a lot of halachas based on that. So, and that's only for the animal of a Jew. Animal of a non-Jew, no problem. They can ride the horse. They can do whatever they want. If the idea of Tsar Bali Chaim is really literally that, oh no animal should ever suffer, then it would apply equally to a goy.
You mean that the animal should have Shabbos?
No. I'm talking about Tsar Bali Chaim. I'm extending it to Tsar Bali Chaim. So if we say that Tsar Bali Chaim is purely for the sake of the animal, then it should apply just as much to the animal of a goy if we see it in trouble. If the Tsar Bali Chaim is more, or at least partly for us to work on ourselves, to have compassion for animals and therefore have compassion for people and so on, then it in a way might be a little more like Shabbos, where it's for our own animals, that we have our animals rest just like we rest and so on, and to extend a midah and a mitzvah in other ways. And then Tsar Bali Chaim might not apply to the same level to the animal of the goy. Thought.
Yeah, well, all right, maybe.
I'd say this: we covered the Lechem Mishnah when we're making Kiddush, so as not to embarrass the rolls, and that's to teach us something. We should go a step further and not bite into the roll. The roll can't possibly like that either. That you're obliterating it afterward.
Yeah, and we give the rolls a week to rest on Pesach.
Right.
That's true too. That's true too.
So the first case that we just said had to do with behema, right? Let's look back at the mnemonic. What is the mnemonic? The mnemonic tells us that we're going to have a siman of 5 different words, which should help us understand whether it's midaraisa. So the first one was behema, behemoth. So the Gemara started off with Lema Messiah Behemoth of the Kachavim, right? So that was the first Behem, and we have no proof positive. Now let's go to the next one. The next one says Tosh Shema. We learned in the Brisa again Behema. So now that's the second Behema, right? The second Umani. Behemoth, and this was a question I think that was raised the last year we had before Yontif. I think someone we started talking about this. So now we're going to have this scenario. Tosh Shema. It says the Brisa. Behemoth Ovdi Kechavim Umasoi Yisrael. What happens if you have a behema of a non-Jew, of an idolater, and the loading, the stuff that was on the back of that animal belonged to a Jew. So now you have Jewish-owned goods on an animal owned by an idolater, right? And the Gemara says the chodalta, you should not help. Basically, the chodalta you have to withdraw. Okay, that's what the Brisa says. Frek the Gemara, same kasha, v'amitzar balachaim deraisa, my v'chadalta, ozov tazov maboyale. What are you telling me, the chodalta? Okay, just because it was the behema of an oved kochavim, which means you can't have a nor from that behema. You can't have a nor from that behema because that behema is used for obviously religious purposes or whatever, and you can't use it. That's a rabbanon. And we have a deraisa that says what? Sar balachayim, amay v'chadalta, osov tazav maboyale. So it's the same kasha now in a different venue, is if you have a mixed use, and part of that use is oived kachavim, and you're going to tell me, well, I can't use the oived kachavim because it's an iser derabanan. But wait a minute, if you're going to hypothesize that sar balachayim is deraisa, I have a problem. Says the Gemara, "La'olam tzar balachayim deraisa." You know what? Again, Chaim, back to the same point. You know what? Let's just agree that tzar balachayim is deraisa, but we're talking about something else. What are we talking about? Hasam b'te'ina. Again, we're talking about loading. So since we established that our brisa is talking about loading, right? That was the first explanation we gave. We said it's talking about loading, not unloading. So therefore, by loading Sar Balechayim, even if it's Doraisa, there's no Tsar Balechayim when you're loading. There's only Tsar Balechayim, we said, when you're unloading, and ours is not a situation of unloading. Okay? So that's the answer. Frek the Gemara, Ihachi, if you're going to take that position, that it's loading, and therefore you don't have to help, even if Tsar Balechayim is Doraisa, aim is Seifa. Look at the Seifa of that same brisa. That Seifa switches the fact pattern, and it says Behemoth Yisrael. The behema belonged to a Jew. Umasoi oivdei kirchavim, and the baggage was the idolater. Okay, and it says Ozov Tazov, right? The Torah tells us Ozov Tazov. The Beteina, if we're talking about loading, right? That's what we said we're talking about. Amai Ozov Tazov. Why is there Ozov Tazov when there's loading? There's no Ozov Tazov. Ozov Tazov is to relieve the pain of the animal, and there's no pain when the animal is waiting to be loaded. There's no pain to the animal. So, in other words, if we're going to say to bring a raya that it's midaraisa, if you flip the switch on the fact pattern, there's no Ozov Tazov. Says the Gemara. And the Chayra, how do you reconcile? Answers the Gemara, Mishum Tzara Yisrael. So the Gemara gives a new teretz, Tzara Yisrael. So now let's take a look at Rashi. Which you said before, he doesn't have to help. Really, we say Tzar Balachayim is Doraisa. The Reisha Tana mitapel bo ben perika ben teina, and in the Reisha you help whether it's unloading or loading. Perika mishum Tzar Balachayim, the teina mishum iba. In other words, we had a havamina that we would, no matter what, help either because of Tzar Balachayim or because of iba. Now iba, by the way, is the Rabbana. In other words, the concept of the relationship between a Jew and a non-Jew is not a Doraisic theory. It's a Rabbanadic theory. So we say that, okay, but Mamonov Shach, you want to help. You want to unload it because it's Tsar Balachayim, but you want to load Mishum Iva. V'te'ina Mishum Iva, V'latina Yayin Oser, the Lav Tsara. But when it comes to loading, since there's no Tsar, so Midoraisa, you don't have to do something. The Lav Iva Ika Ein Zakitlo. In other words, Rashi here is explaining to us that there is a circumstance where you can say that, but when we said it's no raya, really it could be doraisa, but if it's doraisa, why are you not doing it? Well, it's a twofold. You're not unloading because I mean, you would have to unload because it's Sar Balachayim, right? But since we're talking about loading, there's no Tsar Balachayim. What do you possibly have with loading? You have Eva. So Eva is a concept that the Rabbanan have introduced. So it's one Rabbanan versus another Rabbanan. It's a Rabbanan of relationships, we'll call it comedy or whatever you want to call it, or loading, which is also only the Rabbanan. But we have something that we say that when it comes to the relationship, it's possible for the Jew to say to the non-Jew in a sort of a nice sort of way, you know what, I'd love to help you, but I really can't help you because you're carrying a forbidden object. What? Yayin Nesach. So in other words, Iba, you can somehow explain away to the goy by saying, I would love to help you, I'd love to do what I can, but this is forbidden to me. And the goy will sort of accept that. He'll say, okay, basically he's not going to go to war with him when he explains it in a good sort of way. So that's what Rashi says. The Te'ina Yain also, the Lav Tsara Ika, the Lav Iba Ika, because of this explanation, and Zakiklo. So that was the concept. Says the Gemara, Hossam B'Te'ina, the Kamen Parach, the Prekiksiv. So we're going to have a problem because the Brisa wants to answer that we're talking about Te'ina, but you will see later on that the Pasuk also talks about unloading, Prika. So how do you reconcile the Brisa where you don't want to talk about unloading when the Brisa does talk about unloading? Another question. Okay, so what is the answer? Amai Ozav Tazov, and for the Gemara says the Gemara Mishum Tzara Yisrael. What is this Tzara Yisrael? Shetzarech Lahasho Sham. So this is a difficult concept. I have some difficulty with this concept because what we're saying here is that the reason why you don't we're talking about Te'ina, about raising it up, not taking it down. So for the Gemara, my Ozav Tazim says you should help, and for the Gemara Mishum Tzara Yisrael, apparently there is such a thing as Tzara Yisrael, that you're not allowed to inflict any kind of pain on a Jew. What pain are you inflicting? So Rashi says, Shetzorech lahasho shom, because he has to sit and wait. Now that's a little hard. In other words, you have an animal, and the load is on the ground, right? Load is on the ground, and now you have to sort of load it back up. That's going to take some time. If the in this particular circumstance, we're saying it's a behemoth Yisrael. So the Jew owns the behemoth, and the baggage belongs to the Ovid Kachavim. So by letting it sit there for a period of time, you're going to cause tsar to the Yisrael because he's just sitting around and waiting. So I'm trying to understand what kind of tsar that is.
Opportunity cost. He wants to do something else. He wants to get something.
Okay.
Time is money.
Okay, so right. So you could say that time is money, and therefore he is he's losing the money by not hurrying up and doing. But that has nothing to do with the behemoth. You're right. As a concept, it means that time is money, and he's not doing. But there's no direct tsar with regard to the behemoth, right? Because the behemoth is just sitting there waiting to be loaded. It's not under any duress. There's no heavy weight on its back. So is that really tsar? I'm not arguing the point. I'm just saying it's conceptually, that's a little bit hard to understand that it's only because of the loss of potential money. Is that's
Well,
what
it's not tsar to the behemoth, but we're trying to pull the rug out from under this as well, aren't we? In saying that it's no proof.
we're trying to reconcile and say, do we really have to say that Tsar Balachayim is Doraisa? No, we don't, because you can agree it's Doraisa, but here it has nothing to do with Tsar Balachayim.
So that's along these lines. That is along these lines. It's introducing a new concept of,
Right,
of Tirfo or Tzara d'Israel.
right.
And so it's saying you don't necessarily have a proof.
But wait a minute. You
Right.
you don't have. There's no act of doing anything. The animal is not in trouble at that point. You have
Correct.
not loaded it.
Right.
So how can you anticipate that there may be a problem and you're going to wait around for it? Doesn't make sense.
Well, that's why, to me, the waiting around is what's difficult. And we're saying that the waiting around causes the Jew pain. And we're hypothesizing because he's losing money by not using the animal for something else. That's a little bit of a strain, but how else can you explain Tzara d'Yisrael? What pain does the Jew have if the animal just sits there and does nothing?
But what pain does the animal have if it does nothing?
No,
Nothing.
the animal has no pain at all. But
So then what's the pain that you have to wait for it in case it does?
I agree with you, Michael. And
It's
so,
good for the
so does Rabbi Grauman.
that's why I have a little difficulty with.
Right. I'm affirming your point. I didn't mean
Yes,
to.
yeah.
Well, what about we're talking about the situation here? This is a Jew with his own. It's a Jew is leading the quote Jewish animal, but with a non-Jew's load. Correct.
Right.
Okay, so imagine in a modern day, if you have, let's say, a Jew owned a container ship with thousands of containers that got stuck somewhere.
Can't happen.
Can't have, right?
Hypothetically speaking.
Hypothetically speaking. And so the owner of this ship or of this animal would be all distressed, not just time is money, but also that all his customers, his non-Jewish customers, that their loads are now going to be late,
Right.
and he's going to get stressed out because of that.
But
Right.
this is not Sar Bolachayim. I mean,
It's not, but we're
It's
saying
not, it's
Tsar of
not,
the
no.
Yisrael. We're not
No.
saying Tsar of the animal. We
But
say
there,
No,
but
no.
there could be a penalty for late delivery to market. Who knows?
No. So Michael, the point is, that's exactly the point. We're removing it from the Tsar Balachayim discussion, and we're saying Tsar Balachayim could really be Doraisa. But our discussion has nothing to do with Tsar Balachayim. It has to do with the Tsar of the Yisrael. So really, Tsar Balachayim, I can agree with you. It's Doraisa. But you can't apply it here. You can't apply, because it says Ozav Tazov. It says when an animal is sitting there and you have to load it, you have to help load it. Okay, but the animal's not in pain. Okay, fine. Why do you have to load it? Says the Gemara, because Tzara d'Yisrael. The Jew is having tsar by just sitting there and waiting and doing nothing. Therefore, you have to help load it, but it has nothing to do with Tsar Balachayim.
So
that's the
I've got a
answer.
problem. How do you read the person's mind that it's going to have trouble loading it? I mean, it's waiting at that point in time. It's not loaded. It's going to load eventually. And you're
Right.
supposed to wait until that person may have, because you don't see it as you come along at that point. There's
Right.
no tsar.
Right. So we're imputing some kind of discomfort to the Jewish owner by just sitting there doing nothing. That's this answer. Tsar Balachayim, different parsha. Yes, it is deraisa, it's not deraisa. But when you come along and you see an animal just relaxing, no pain, and a whole bunch of goods strewn around on the ground, and you say, who owns this? Who owns this? So the Jew says, I own the animal, and the non-Jew says, I own the goods. And so then the question is, all right, what do we do? So in other words, you have a pasuk that says Ozav Tazov, that you have to help. Why do you have to help? Why? Because the Torah says that when the animal is just sitting there and needs to be helped to put on the goods, you have to help. So, right, but that's not Tsar Balachayim. So Tsar Balachayim has nothing to do with this. It only has to do with Tzara d'Yisrael. And for Tzara d'Yisrael, we say you have to help because of Tzara Yisrael. So the pasuk of Osav Tazov now goes to referring to the Jewish owner of the animal, that he has to be helped because he has pain. He has pain, whole new concept, pain to the owner, not pain to the animal.
But Rabbi, if he's making money to transport the goods, why does he have pain? That's his business.
But he's sitting and waiting and doing nothing because no one is helping. So the question is, do you have a responsibility when you come along to help him load it? That's the question now.
But you're saying he's resting now, he's not loading.
He's not loading, and the question.
So you don't know when he's going to load.
No.
You have to ask him when.
He's not loading because he's not able to load by himself.
So he needs the help of the fellow, and the Torah says also that you have to help. And so I'm the fellow who came along, and you're telling me, can you help me load? Because it says Ozav Tazov, and I say, but wait a minute, it's Yayin Nesech, it's the stuff belongs to a non-Jew. Why should I help load? And he says, but wait a minute, but I'm suffering. The Jew am suffering because my animal is sitting there doing nothing. And let's say time is money. So I'm the one who's losing. So you have to help a fellow Jew, regardless of Tzar Balachai. You have to help a fellow Jew because he's in pain. So that's the point here. Is that
but look, all of this is reaching for he and the Beis HaMedrash who doesn't want this to be Doraisa, he'll come up with all these things.
That's correct. That's correct.
All of this is reaching. I mean, I don't understand why someone in the Beis HaMedrash on the day they were doing this didn't just say Lo Sachsom Shor B'disho, and that's your proof, and we could darshan from that how respectful you have to be of an animal's possible suffering, and finished.
Well, again, they're sitting and darshaning, and their whole discussion is Sar Balachayim Deraisa, and then someone gets up and said, forget about it. This Brisa has nothing to do with Sar Balachayim. It has to do with Tzara Yisrael, whether or not you can inflict pain on a fellow Jew by not helping him, even though the pasuk says Ozav Tazov, but you're not helping him, and he is suffering in a way that maybe we don't understand because he has this animal.
For the cynical among us, myself, I think, this isn't just pure halachic debate or quoting someone else whose positions are usually consistent and you found an inconsistency. No, you're just taking theories out of thin air and saying, look at this. This is a reasonable theory.
So let me introduce that what the Gemara, and you're not far off the truth, Chaim, because what the Gemara is introducing, and will tell us in greater detail shortly, is that there is a certain, I'll call it menschlichkeit, but I don't know if that's the right word. There's a certain sort of intrinsic feeling a Jew has for another Jew, that when it comes to his goods, you can't let him suffer. If there's something you can do to help a Jew, then you have to help him. And we're going to see that more clearly in just a minute. So here, no Tsar Balachayim, not an issue. But the Jew is suffering. How is he suffering? Because he's sitting there doing nothing with an animal that he has to use, and you can help him in a way that will alleviate his suffering. So the Talmidei Chachamim sitting around in the Beis Medrash said, you know what? This is something that we have to embrace, and we have to say that even though the pasuk Ozav Tazov dealt with the animal, that you have to help him load the animal. That's what the pasuk means. In this particular case, the animal isn't suffering. Why Ozav Tazov? Because your neighbor is suffering. Because you have to be a mensch. You have to somehow, it doesn't affect you negatively, but you can help him positively. So yes, they sat around and they said, we're going to come up with this theory.
Okay, if what you're saying is true, and I certainly believe you, that this is a thing, then yes, then it's legitimate that they came up with this, because for Yisrael.
That's right. And that's what the Gemara is telling us, that this theory of helping a fellow Jew is a legitimate theory that we can introduce. Now, having said that, says the Gemara right away, Ihachi afilu reisha. If you're going to introduce Tzara Yisrael, that there's such a thing as Tzara Yisrael, what was the first part of that of Raisa? The first part, we had the behema of a non-Jew and the package of a Jew, right? So we had two circumstances: one where the behema belonged to a Jew, and one where the behema belonged to a non-Jew. Our discussion of Tzara Yisrael was when the behema belonged to the Jew. Now, wait a minute. What did we say in the first part of that brisa? If the behema was Ovid Kachavim L'Masa Yisrael, and we said Chadalta, he doesn't have to help. So from there, we extrapolated that what he doesn't have to help, even though it says Ozav Tazov, because Tzar Balachayim is the Raisa, but we're talking about loading. So now the Gemara is going to ask the question, why do you have to talk about loading? Let the Reisha also talk about Tzara Yisrael. In other words, who says Tzara Yisrael is only when the animal belongs to a Jew?
Right.
Maybe Tzara Yisrael applies even when the packages belong to a Jew, is because the non-Jewish owner, the Ovid Kachavim who owns the animal, he's not going to load, and this Jew has a whole bunch of packages he has to bring to market, and they're sitting on the ground doing nothing. So the kasha then becomes, use the same theory of Tzara Yisrael for the first part. For the first part, we didn't use Tzara Yisrael. We only came on this theory when the animal was owned by the Jew. What do you mean? Tzara Yisrael works both ways. If a Jew has goods that have to come to market, if that's the Tsar, and the goy owns the Ovid Kachavim owns the animal, and it's not being, and you're not helping, you're not loading. Because of that. Why? Because it's te'ina, it's loading, and loading is there's no tsar, there's no reason to help load a yayin nesef of a non-Jew. Absolutely no reason, because it's also b'hanah. So by helping him, you're gonna be violating a rabbinic decree, and there's no oraisa of tzar balachayim, let's say. So then the Gemara asks, Yehacha afila reisha nami. It should also be tzara Yisrael. So that's the Gemara's kasha in twisting around the theory and saying it works both ways. So says the Gemara, no, you can't do that. Why? Reisha b'chamar Ovid Kachavim, Seifa b'chamar Yisrael. The Reisha, when we're talking about a behema of an Ovid Kachavim, is speaking about. So each of these, when you have an animal that is loaded and is walking, you have a person that's walking with this animal. Well, that animal isn't walking alone, and the person who's walking with the animal is, he's urging it, he's whipping it, he's cajoling it, he's doing what he has to do. So the Gemara tells us in the ratio, when we're talking about a behema of an Ovid Kachavim, it's b'chamar Ovid Kachavim. We're talking about the owner who is driving it is a non-Jew, he's an Ovid Kachavim. Seifa b'chamar Yisrael. The Seifa, where the animal belonged to the Jew, you're talking about a Jewish owner who's pushing. So what does that mean? So it says Rashi, so right away you have to understand, b'chamar Ovid Kachavim, ve'ein bal hamasa sham bala Ovid Kachavim litam. In the ratio where the fellow who is running the show here is a Ovid Kachavim, there's no Jew around. So the whole question of Tzara Yisrael doesn't apply because he's not there. In other words, Tzara Yisrael means that there's a Jew hanging around, he's standing there, nothing is happening to his animal or to the goods, and he is getting very upset, and it's causing him tsar. Right. The Gemara is now telling us there's no tsar in that case because he's not there. When you have a non-Jewish Ovid Kachavim who's running the program, then he's the one who is pushing the animal. Whereas in the Seifa, where we're talking about a Jewish animal, there you can say Tzara Yisrael because we were talking about a Chamar Yisrael. The owner, the Jewish owner, is the one who is cajoling and urging on the animal. So, in other words, you wanted to say that it should be one fits all. Torah says it's not one fits all because a Jewish owner is only there when his animal is running, but when his goods are there and not his animal, he's not there. How do you know? My pasakta. How do you know that? In other words, the question is wondering. Rashi, b'chi pasakta hadava. Is it a psak halacha? The whole behema ovid kachavim have a chamar ovid kachavim. The whole behema Yisrael have a chamar Yisrael. Is it somehow etched in stone that when the animal is belongs to a non-Jew, only the non-Jewish owner is there, and vice versa for Yisrael. Where do you know that from? My Pesachta. And for the Gemara, Stama de Milsa Insher Basa Chamra Ozel. In other words, there is a general rule that when a person is going to market and he has an animal, it's the owner of that animal that is leading the animal. He doesn't hire out someone else. So in other words, you wouldn't have a Jew leading a non-Jewish, an animal of a non-Jew to market. So, okay, so he gives this teretz that Tsar of the Yisrael can only apply by when you have a Jewish animal, in other words, owned by a Jew, because otherwise he wouldn't even be there to have the Tsar of the delay. We're talking about delay here, and there's no Tsar. He's not around. Okay, so the Gemara gave an answer. Again, Chaim, I know you have a problem, and maybe others too. We're somehow fitting the pieces together in order to reach a conclusion that we want to reach. Got it. That's exactly what the Gemara wants to do. But the Gemara has a havamina that this Tsar Yisrael has some kind of an impact here. So if it has an impact, why doesn't it have an impact on whether it's a Jewish animal or not a Jewish animal? Teretz is, when it's not a Jewish animal, there's no Tsar Yisrael because the Yisrael is not there. He's not even around, because of the principle that when you have an animal, it's the owner of the animal who's driving it. Okay, I accept that, and that's the teretz. So therefore, Stama de Milza Inish Basachamra Ozel, Frank the Gemara Chadalta Ozav Tazov, but I still have the problem of Ozav Tazov. Okay, so it's a non-Jewish owner who has the animal. It says Ozav Tazov. Teretz is Beprika hu diksivi. Ozav Tazov says when the animal is loaded and you have to unload it because of pain, then it's Ozav Tazov, right? Ozav Tazov, the word's Ozav Tazov. Here we're talking about a non-Jewish animal, and we're talking about loading. Remember, the Brisa is now talking about loading, not unloading. And loading, there is never a pressing need to help to load because there's no tsar. So in other words, we're back to square one. Is it deraisa? Is it not deraisa? Says the Gemara, Amalei, hi Mani, who is the author of this particular theory that what? That you don't have to help because of Te'ina? Rabbi Yosef Haglili, the Omer Tzar Balachayim Lav the Oraisa. So we want to bring a raya from this brisa that Tzar Balachayim is not the Oraisa. Therefore, it's Rabbi Yosef Haglili who is the Manda Omar, and therefore it's very easy to say, you know what? You don't, even though it says Ozav Tazov, that is only for unloading. Our brisa is talking about loading. And about loading, we're basically makel. We say you don't have to help. So therefore, you don't have to help. And the reason why you don't have to help is because Tzar Balachayim is not the Oraisa. So he wants to bring a direct proof from this brisa that Tzar Balachayim is not the Oraisa, and that we hold like Rabbi Yosef Haglili, and therefore it's two rabbinics. It's a rabbinic of Yayin Nesech and a rabbinic of helping, because Te'ina is not Midaraisa. So we say, okay, if that's the case, then the Gemara here concedes that it should be the halacha is like Rabbi Yosef Haglili. Okay, so in this particular Toshma, we come out that Rabbi Yosef Haglili is that Manda Amar. So now we've covered the first two mnemonics of Behema. So let's just go, we have a little bit more time. So let's just do one more. So we have another Toshma, another Brisa. Toshma. Okay, this is a very interesting scenario. Ohev lifro v'sone lito. Let's say a man comes walking along and he sees two people with animals. A friend of his has an animal that's straining under the goods, meaning it really needs help. But he also has a sone, someone who he doesn't like, who has an animal that needs to be loaded. So now he has to make a choice. Do I help my friend who needs help with his animal to unload? or do I help my friend, my enemy, Shone, who needs help loading? So listen to this. Says the Gemara.
Mitzvah besone kidei
Mitzvah
lichaf
besone.
yitzra.
The
Wow.
mitzvah is in the sone, to help
Wow.
the sone before you help the ohev. Why? And again, we talked earlier about relationships.
But then we're showing that Tsar Bali Chaim doesn't come into play here because it's
That-
the unloading that hurts the animal.
That's the raya he wants to bring. Now he wants to bring that raya that you see that in a circumstance where l'chayra, you should immediately help the ohev because his animal is suffering. If you say Tsar Balachayim is Doraisa, there's no question that you have to help the ohev, right?
Right.
Says the Gemara, no. Tsar Balachayim may even be Doraisa. So you should go help the ohev. But listen to this, Kedei Lochov, it's Yitzro, in order to assuage his Yetzer Hara. In other words, just like we said before, that a person has a responsibility to a fellow Jew not to have Tzara Yisrael, meaning that you shouldn't let another Jew suffer in some way. Here too, he has to work on himself, that he himself should be a better person, and he shouldn't let the Sone go. The Isol Kedatach Tzar Balachayim Deraisa Chaim, like you just said. If you say Tzar Balachayim is Deraisa, Ha'odeflei, he should certainly help the Ohev. Why is he helping the Sone? So it's a powerful message that this Gemara is teaching us, that in the case where you have two circumstances, one that might be Doraisa, because it's Tsar Balachayim, even if it is Tsar Balachayim, there's such a thing as Lochofes Yitzro, that you have to work on yourself as a person to become a better person, that you can violate a Doraisa.
So it's no
That's what
proof,
this
it's
Gemara
no
is
proof
concluding.
even there.
Yeah, the Gemara isn't trying to cheat here and say, oh, it's not Doraisa. I grant you Tsar Balachayim is Doraisa. I don't hold like Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Why don't I help the Ohev whose animal is suffering? Because I have to help myself. I, as a person, have to work on myself to become a better person and not to let my feelings towards an enemy, a Sone, get the better of me. So in order to do that, I have to violate, quote unquote, violate the mitzvah of the Torah, but we're allowing you to do it to better yourself. So this Gemara is sending a powerful message that there are times when you have to weigh the mitzvah in the Torah, just like we said, Tzara Yisrael. Now we're talking about Lochofes Yitzro.
So that also has like a Doraisa aspect to it, or not necessarily?
Well, Lochofes Yitzro is not really a Doraisa. No, it's not a Doraisa.
So it's just a question of what's important.
But we're saying that you have to work on yourself to the point where even if you have to violate a mitzvah in the Torah, i.e. Tzar Balechayim, you're allowed to do it in order to better yourself, that you should become a good person. That's the conclusion of this Gemara, that making you a better person is very, very important. Okay. So
Rabbi, can I ask a question about that?
yeah.
So it means that you look for, if it's an enemy, you look to try to do something that may not be the most important thing to do because it's your enemy and it's your Yetzer Hara, you would go against it. So you want to help them regardless of what's the right thing to do.
Right. In other words, if you come to a circumstance, a fork in the road, where you can do something that would be a mitzvah, or do something else which is not a mitzvah but makes you a better person because it shows you can overcome your bias. Exactly. So, Michael, your point is that in that particular case, working on yourself, that you should become a better person, will make you a better person in the future. And therefore, if you violate this one mitzvah, the Gemara is saying, nish gefährlich to violate this mitzvah.
I have a problem with that, because if you do that, then you might be prone to do that all the time to avoid doing a mitzvah.
It's rationalizing. You'll find
Right.
it too easy to
Yeah.
rationalize, and we
Right,
can't be
right.
trusted with our human nature to rationalize.
Right. And this is where you need to load to take away the burden somehow. That's even making a double hoops to jump through.
Well, again, right. So the Bryce is talking about loading, but he's saying even if it's Tsar Balachayim where it's unloading, because loading has no Tsar Balachayim. loading is a let's call it.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so even where it's unloading, where you would have a mitzvah to go ahead and help, there is an exemption to that mitzvah, and it's a narrow exemption. It's an exemption that, and again, it's subjective. So you have to be the one to say to yourself, and we'll see the next Gemara, he gives us even more food for thought. But you have to be the one to say, you know what? I have to be kovish my yitzro here. It's easy for me to help the guy I like because his animal is suffering and it's the right thing to do. But then I'm turning my back on my enemy, and the Torah specifically says that's not what a Jew should do. That when it comes to a soneh, you have to embrace him. Again, the question will be right away, by the way, whether it's a Jewish soneh or not. So, but before we go too far down the road, let me just hint to you that that's a question that comes up. What happens if it's a non-Jewish soneh versus a Jewish soneh? Important distinction, Michael, because I don't want to get too far down and say that, chas v'sholom, you have someone who is an anti-Semite or a Jewish hater or something. Do you have responsibilities to him? That next Gemara is going to explain that to us. But in principle, when you weigh the two, it's not an automatic that you help the person whose animal is in tsar, because remember, one is an animal and one is a human being. So I'll rationalize to you, okay, I'll give you a rationalization. While we have all kinds of responsibilities to animals, we are very sensitive to animals, animals still take second place to humans. Why? So in other words, you're allowed to kill an animal. Why would you kill an animal if you have to be so sensitive to it? Why would you kill an animal? Teretz is, there are times when you can kill an animal for the sake of a human, right? If you need, I'm not talking about shechita or necessarily, but you kill an animal because you need, you want to skin it and you want to use it. That's a permissible form of what you can do to an animal. It's causing the animal tsar. Why would you do it? Teretz is that under certain circumstances you can use the animal to advance the human cause. Okay, that's the general principle.
But Rabbi, let me just make one point.
Yeah.
The animal may be a situation of life or death. The individual has SAR because of the trouble he's having in loading, which is not the same as unloading. So you're equating, even though an animal is subservient to a human in terms of importance, you're still weighting life or death for a living being versus someone who's uncomfortable or unhappy. How do you make that?
What you've stated is two statements, and one of the statements carries more weight because he's a soneh. So you're absolutely right, Michael. How do you weigh one against the other? The teretz is, if that's all there was, if it was two guys you liked, I like this guy, I like this guy. This guy has a trouble with an animal that's suffering. This guy, it has no trouble with an animal that's suffering. I grant you've got to help the ohev whose animal is suffering because they're even Steven. But once the weight of the circumstance changes, because not only is he not suffering, but he belongs to a soneh. It's the soneh that is weighing down the decision here, not the fact that I've got one worse tsar, one there's not tsar. I grant you, if they're even Steven and one is tsar and one is not tsar, and they're both perfectly best friends, you've got to go to the one who has the tsar because the tsar really outweighs. But we're talking about weighing tsar versus soneh, and the point of this Gemara is that it's important enough that your character be developed so that you are not biased to the soneh, that you overcome the bias even though Tsar Balachayim is derisa. It's a tough one. I grant you, Michael, it's a tough one. But when you're comparing the two, if they're totally even, you always have to go with the more difficult situation. In this case, it would be Tsar Balachayim. But we're saying Tsar Balachayim is important. but it's Tsar Balachayim to a behema versus enhancing you as a human being to another human being. And that takes precedent. A little hard maybe to, you understand what I'm saying? In other words, you have to work on yourself even as you're trying to fulfill a mitzvah to an animal, which is important, but not as important, says the Gemara, as working on yourself. So this pneumatic where it says about ohev, the word ohev here means that you have someone that you care for who needs the help, but you're still not helping him because there's a counterbalancing force where the sone has to be, in other words, you have to assuage the Yetzer Hara in you, and that's how important it is. Obviously, this Gemara is teaching us that for all of us walking around, we have these biases and these feelings. We've got to work on them to become better human beings. That we should not look at. Look. We just went through Pesach. I mean, what better example? And what do we say? We say Avodah Mayinu, that we have to have. We don't say whole Hallel on Chol Hamoed. Why? Because of the tsar of the Mitzrim. Are you kidding me? The Mitzrim? They're the last person I should be giving any kind of lip service to. Why do I care about a Mitzri? Let him die. He should die in the Yam Suf. Teretz is he dies in the Yam Suf, but you can't be happy that he died in the Yam Suf.
Right. I mean, Hashem did all these nisim for us, and then he still says, "Maseh yadai tovim biyam v'atem," and you're being happy and singing.
Exactly right. So this fits right into our theory here that as Jews, we have to refine our character, that even in the worst of the worst, we have to find something positive. And sometimes it's maddening. I have to find something positive to a guy who just slaughtered my family. He's killed Klal Yisrael. How do I do that? The teretz is because he is created in the image of God, even though he's a horrible human being, but he's created in the image of God. And the Rebbeinu Shalom says, you as a Yid have to have that gefühl. You have to have that sort of extra feeling that a Goy doesn't have. The Goy doesn't have that feeling that I have to. I mean, he'll wipe you out in an instant, right? You can't do that. So this Gemara fits right into that whole scenario of working on yourself to be a better human being. You can even violate a mitzvah min Torah. Okay, we'll allow you. We'll allow you. Okay.
So we've knocked out 3 of the 5 acronyms.
We knocked out 3 of the 5. And it's 1:15, so maybe we'll just stop because the Gemara continues on with this mnemonic to show us, again, in 2 other circumstances, whether or not. So the question always is, the central question is, Tsar Balachayim Deraisa. Is it a raya to Rabbi Yossi or is it not a raya? So sometimes we say, oh, it looks like it's a raya. It's not a raya because we're talking about something else. So we're going back and forth here. And as of this sitting, we don't have any proof. Right. That Tsar Balachayim is the Raisa, because we can always find a reason in this particular case why we're not saying Tsar Balachayim.
Right.
Okay, so we'll stop here, Mitchell. We'll pick up on the bottom of Lamed Beis of this Toshima.
Shkach.